আমার ওই ফোনটা দাও তো রিনি, ওই ফোনটা ওইখানে
Sir, shall we
Good.
start?
Yes,
I
yes,
think Madhumita di has already joined
yeah,
us.
yes. He has already joined. Just now, right now.
Yes. Yes. So once again, a very good morning to all, uh, and welcome to this ongoing series of lectures, specially designed for UG Semester 3 and Semester 5, and organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQAC Kegedash College. Today, we have with us our speaker, Dr. Madhumita Majumder, Assistant Professor in English at Bhangar Mahavidyalaya, and our principal, Dr. Ramkrishna Prasad Chakraborty. Uh, on behalf of the Department of English, Kegedash College, I heartily welcome them. Now, may I request to our principal, Honorable Dr. Ramkrishna Prasad Chakraborty, to introduce our speaker and say a few words. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Animesh. Very good morning, my dear students. And special thanks to Dr. Madhumita Majumder, who has extended his support towards the noble venture of creating this type of global classroom system. So thank you, Madhumita, for supporting our students. My dear student, I have given you the advice that you must go through your Google Classroom. Please, you go through Google Classroom. And how to use this Google Classroom, we will take a session on Monday from 4 p.m. How to use Google Classroom. This is the open session will be organized by the Department of Computer Science of our college on next Monday. Because what I got from the different teachers and the students, they don't know to use the Google Classroom, how to use it, how to submit the uh, notes, how to give the question paper or any assignment uploadation. So you must attend this lecture also. That will be a nice lecture. And for today's lecture, I hope you are enjoying this series of lecture, and you must submit your feedback at the end of the day. That is on the 5th lecture day. You must submit your feedback because your feedback is very much essential for us. So whether you are enjoying or not, I hope today's lecture you will enjoy very much. Thanks once again, Madhumita, for coming here and spared your valuable time. Thank you all. And also the thanks to the Department of Computer Science. Special thanks to Mridul Bhaumik for giving this type of opportunity, this using this classroom and Google Meet and technical support. Thank you. Thanks all once again. So now it is time to proceed on the lecture. Just Animesh, you just
Yes,
introduced.
Sir. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Now, may I request to our speaker, Dr. Madhumita Majumder, uh, to proceed her deliberation. And she'll be talking about Harlem. You have already know about the poem Harlem. It has been already in your syllabus. So over to you, ma'am.
A very good morning to everyone. And thank you, Principal Sir, for giving this opportunity. And thank you for having this wonderful idea of creating this pool of, I would say, sharing pool, where I think not only students, but I think across our teaching fraternity, we are likely to benefit from each other. So thank you for thinking about this wonderful idea. And thank you, Animesh. And I would welcome my dear students who are here with me today, this morning. So thank you so much. I will begin, perhaps, I will put it in this way that I intend to have my lecture divided into, let's say, 4 slots so that, before we come to the poem, we sort of have an idea, why this particular poem, Harlem, actually got written. That is perhaps important for us to understand, to get the temperament of this particular poem. So that is something that I will try and do as I, talk about Harlem Renaissance to begin with. What is Harlem Renaissance? And, within it, I will try and talk about the Great Migration, the Jim Crow laws, etc. I will come, as we proceed in that way. To begin with, Harlem Renaissance, I would say, is a cultural celebration. So for African Americans, for centuries of slavery and the struggle to abolish the slavery law did not end their, fight for equality. So ending the slavery law in 1864 perhaps was a beginning of the milestone. So, a lot of other things were waiting, to happen. Segregations, lynching against them continued and continued galore. I think, it wouldn't be very difficult to identify it, if you would remember, even in the recent times, the kind of atrocities, legal atrocities that would continue against Black Americans in America till date. So starting in about, let's say, 1819, African Americans migrated to the north, from the south, which would be a more non-urban texture to a more industrialized and more urban texture in the north. So this is called the Great Migration. Eventually, that would relocate hundreds of African Americans from rural south to the urban north, as one would say. So this would be a kind of a shared experience. So if I am to talk about geographically about this place of Harlem, you would remember that this is, Manhattan, somewhere near New York. So this is a small ghetto, where a number of, African Americans would be staying. And so this would become just not a place where they would, learn to call home. Activities. This would be the center of protest. It would be an explosion. This would be about disposed sensibilities. You have nowhere to go, and this is your country, but you are not accepted here. So this is a kind of I wouldn't just say a tragedy, but this would be a kind of a displacement that they had to live with for a long time. The Great Migration has been called the push and pull. So, in 1864, after the abolition of the slavery laws, what would come to existence is the Jim Crow laws. Jim, Jim Crow, CROW, Crow laws. Now, this particular law was named after a Black minstrel show character. The laws which had existed for about more than 100 years, from the post-civil era, say until 1968, were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them basic right to vote, to go get jobs, to get educations. There would be separate schools, for them, so they wouldn't go to white schools. So those who attempted, to defy this Jim Crow laws, they would, face arrest and even sentences, death sentences would be passed against them. Within it, I would like to, talk about something which is known as the Black Codes. Now, what were Black Codes? The Black Codes were strict local and state laws that detailed when and how formerly enslaved people could work and how much could they get paid. What kind of a payment would they be giving? So the codes appeared, throughout South, that is the South part of America, as a legal way to put the Black citizens into, indentured servitude, to take away their voting rights, to take control, about, even over their own lives, the quality of lives. Their children would be seized for labor purposes. So the legal system sort of tagged the Black Americans. So there would be the confederate of soldiers, who would work as police and judge. So even if, you went to the court and sort of, challenged these laws, you are unlikely to win the cases because, it would be a system, which would have police and judges who actually believed that the Blacks needed to have and to be shown their position. So that is, frightening to say the least. To show that, what it exactly meant, at that time, I would talk, this post slavery era is, in American history, it is called the Reconstruction era. So where you are trying to, sort of vitalize, you're trying to infuse, you're trying to incorporate everyone, into the society. But of course, the Black Americans faced their troubles, as we could say. So there would be something which is known as the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan, Kuklux Klan is KLAN. This would actually be, a group of people, who would violently attack the African Americans. Their schools would be vandalized, as I had spoken about. They would be violently attacked. They would be tortured, and they would be lynched. Families would be attacked, and they would be forced, off their lands across the South. So, this would be a ruthless organization that would be, in Tennessee. So you can understand, how this group, which would be, in abbreviation called KKK, would be a secret society sort of terrorizing the African Americans, and sort of pushing them into the very, very criminal alleys of life. So they wouldn't be left with any kind of a survival motive, or they wouldn't have much to work through which they could actually earn their livelihood. So that would be that bad. So with the 1880s, big cities in the South, they would be some, wouldn't be initially very aggressive to this African American community. So a substantial population then of the South, not so big cities and the rural areas, would move to the cities of the South. Now, moving there, of course, meant now in the big cities, they wanted to now limit the lives of the African Americans themselves. So there would be, very public displays of it. So you would have, public parks which would be forbidden to the African Americans. There would be theaters, there would be restaurants to which they would not be allowed to enter. So segregated waiting rooms in buses and stations, were required, as well as, water fountains, restrooms, buildings, entrances, etc. So law sort of forbade Americans, African Americans, even living in white neighborhood. So you could even own a property there. So it was forced everywhere, even in asylums, even in centers for the elderly and the handicapped. You saw that this kind of segregation remained. So some states would even go to the extent of having separate textbooks for Black children and, of course, for white. So, they would have separate schools and separate textbooks. So in Atlanta, it went to that extent where the court would see that a different Bible was given to the white people than that was given to the Black people. So, and this was, uncommon, that the African Americans were sort of welcome anywhere. It naturally meant, there would be protest. You would, protest against this kind of, I wouldn't just say atrocities, but this kind of inhuman treatment that was there. So you would have people like Ida Bells, you would have, who would devote fighting against the Jim Crow's laws. You would have Charlotte Hawkins Browns, and you would have Isha Montgomery. So, a number of them, who would talk about, taking off signs, which would say that, Africans were not to be allowed and they were not meant to be part of this particular social vocabulary, America, which talked about, a big dream. I would come to this concept of this big dream because as we begin the poem, you would remember that the line begins with the dream. So they were completely out of it, and they were not to be part of it, almost in a legal, political, social manner. They were being marginalized. They were being pushed into the periphery of the society. So as the 20th century progressed, of course, the Jim Crow laws flourished within an oppressive society that continued to believe in violence against the African Americans. Now, following the First World War, there would be lynching that became so relevant that you could understand there would be hate groups, small hate groups which would function. So at least across 25 states in United States of America at that time, in 1919, you would see these race riots taking place. So in 1919, a period is sometimes called as a Red Summer. In retaliation, white authorities charged Black communities with conspiring to conquer white America. So, they were sort of, forced, to do that. Sorry. So millions of South Black people, white people attempted to ban newspaper, threaten violence, caught reading or distributing it. I'm sorry, there's an echo, I presume. Now, the poverty of the Great Depression only deepened resentment with the rise of lynchings. And after the Second World War, Black veterans would return home met with segregation and violence. And this was, 1945, 1946, and things had not changed. So this Jim Crow laws, continued in temperamentally for such a long time. So since I was talking about the experience in the South, the question is, was it very different in the North? This was the Great Migration, as I said, and people were moving towards the North. So how much did it change? Black people began to own property, they could vote, they could go to schools, but even in the North, there would be segregations, there would be signs which said only white people. So that was, in that way, even in 1867 in Ohio, Ellen Granbury Thurman ran an election promising to bar Black citizens from voting. After he narrowly lost the political race, Thurman was appointed to the US Senate, where he fought to dissolve Reconstruction-era reforms benefiting African Americans. So you can completely understand the kind of regressive policies that were actually followed against them. So after the Second World War, urban developments in North and South were created with legal convents which did not allow Black families and Black people found it difficult, to survive. So, as I was, suggesting, even after the Second World War, the suburban developments in the North and South were created with legal convents, and this would not allow the Black families, Black people to live. So, how did this, Jim Crow law end? In the post-war era, there was an increase in the civil rights activities in the African American community with a focus on ensuring that the Black citizens were able to vote. And this ushered what is known as the Civil Rights Movement. So 1948, now this would be, the time, if you would remember in the world history, would also be the time where a number of countries like India and others, who would gain freedom. So, this was also temperamentally, a time, of rebel, of breaking away. So in 1948, you had President Harry Truman, who ordered integration in the military, and in the year 1954, the Supreme Court ruled, that educational segregation was unconstitutional, ending what is known as the era of separate but, equal education, as one would say. In 1964, you would have the president, Lyndon Johnson, signing the Civil Rights Act, which legally ended the segregation. By 65, there was voting rights. I'm not going beyond it because, the poem that we will discuss would be, written in 1951. So it is just trying to understand, the kind of, I would say, emotional context in which the poem was being written. So hate groups and everything needed to be understood. Now, coming to the cultural aspect of the Harlem Renaissance, which of course is very, very important for one to understand, there would be, uh, all factors, economic factors, which had pushed the African Americans, to the north. In the north, it would mean there would be complaints by the white laborers who would say that the black laborers were willing to work for a much lesser amount of money, and that, of course, meant that there would be a fresh set of segregation there. So this would mean that this would be a time of protest, and this would be called Harlem Renaissance. Now, when you're using a word like Renaissance, the question is, what is Renaissance? It should percolate to the lowest of the lowest. That means, somebody who's absolutely at the bottom strata of the society should resonate with the idea of what that particular time of Renaissance actually wishes to propagate. So this is exactly what is being done. So you have musicians, you have writers, you have plays being written, which talk about the African way of life, which talks about, of creating a history. One of the allegations, against the African American society would be that, the lack of history, the lack of language in that way, So this would be a kind of a response. And it is natural, you got to understand that this would be a language of protest. You are protesting. So Harlem brought notice to great works that that were produced that would otherwise be sort of be lost to us. With the end of the Civil War in 1865, hundreds of thousands of African American, now freed, began to talk about political empowerment. They began to talk about equal economic opportunity. They began to talk about economic and cultural self-determination. So with booming economies across the North and Midwest, offering industrial jobs for workers for every race, many African Americans realized their hopes for a better standard of living and a more racially tolerant society. But did that happen? No, that was an absolute no. So the Great Migration, meant it also led to a concentration. Concentration in this place that I talked about, Harlem, and this would be the largest concentration of the Black people in the world. It became a kind of a destination for African Americans from all backgrounds, from unskilled laborers to educated middle class people. They shared the experiences of slavery, emancipation, and racial oppression. In the South, even educated Black would realize that they had no employment. Nobody would take them into employment. So they also moved, to this North. So, and this discrimination against them, forged a new identity. They wanted to call themselves free people. So that was a common thing that bound the whole African American community living in this place called Harlem. So it became a kind of a mecca of culture, of protest, of a new identity, everything you could say together. So Alan Locke, a critic and a teacher, said that, and he was also known, who became the dean of, the Harlem Renaissance, described this age as a spiritual coming of age in which African Americans transformed social disillusionment to race pride. So among the Renaissance, many significant, contributors would be there. There would be W.E. Boyce, Marcus Garvey, Cyril Briggs, Walter Francis White, electrifying performers like Josephine Baker, Paul Robeson, writers like, Hudson, Newson, visual artists like Aaron Douglas, Augusta Savage. So there would be legendary musicians, and countless others, making it a vibrant cultural center. Harlem became the epicenter, in a way, of the American culture also. The neighborhood bustled with African American owned and run publishing houses, newspapers, music companies, playhouses, nightclubs, cabaret houses, literature, music, and fashion, all, define culture, cool for black and white. Now, these this small I would say music houses, where you would have music being played. One of the most famous places would be Cotton. Uh, now, what would happen? There would be, an interesting thing amongst the audience. Not only the black people, sometimes the white would also come and watch this performance. So you can see that this is a kind of a confluence of of coming together. This is what exactly the agenda of the Harlem Renaissance was. To bring together, to be incorporated in the mainstream. So most importantly, Harlem Renaissance instilled in African Americans across the country a new spirit of self-determination and pride, a new consciousness that was there. Now, talking about Langston Hughes, his father, was the grandson of a Jewish slave trader. And of course, he did not consider himself black. So he was somebody who was not interested in forging the black agenda. So Hughes was, breaking away from his father, breaking away from the tradition, and was, of course, taking forward this idea of, black identity and black culture, fighting for it and using his poetry as a form of protest. What becomes interesting that Hughes at one particular point, he sort of remembers and experiences his experience in the African world, where he says that when I went to Africa, I wasn't considered a black. They said my hair was, too straight to be black, and they said, apart from a few features here and there, and, when they looked at me, they said, you white? I mean, like they did not think that he was black enough, So he faced that kind of, apathy also. But, Hughes was convinced and Hughes was committed to the idea of forging identity, individuality for the black community. So, in you would say that Hughes belonged to that group of party with other promising black writers and editors, who would, even work with mainstream magazines like the Harper's, talking, about this need of incorporating and bringing together the black who have been for so long marginalized. Now, I was talking about the Cotton Club with the groundbreaking, new music, which became a vibrant, and gave it a kind of a nightlife in Harlem also. Savoy, opened in 1927, so they would have ballrooms, etc. But these would mean cultural bloom. This would have musicians like Paul Robeson and others, using and breaking this, stereotypical role of a serious drama, and you would have this kind of, music presentation. Now, from here, I would try and talk about, Zaz music, which is an important component of understanding Hughes' poetry. So the first thing that I would want to talk about is the fact that the African slave brought to America, was in Jamestown, and it was Virginia in the year 1690. So the role of music in the human culture in African communities, especially in America, as Robert Garfias would say, I quote, music adds to the culture and is an important form and avenue for personal and group expression in it. It is also very much a product of that culture, of all influences, historical, political, and economic, as well as aesthetic, which have played upon it, unquote. So, music was rooted in the lives of the Africans who were first brought to America as slaves. And, what was interesting, the African slave continued to chant his native chants, sing his native songs at work, even though the singing of them might have been forbidden or completely out of context. But being forbidden, the songs were after a time changed into forms, which would get into the contemporary context. So if you're looking at the history of jazz, you cannot deny that much of it would be in a kind of, an African. So to describe it, there would be, a dance of seemingly contradictions, accompanies, which would be there. So music to the African American was an escape. What kind of an escape? A means to counter the harsh and unpleasant conditions they were subjected to live in. Music paved the way for them to face, or allowed them to face, the many challenges of life. So sometimes, they crooned their heart out into the dead of the night. Music provided what nothing else could have done to them. It sort of gave them a kind of a way to sort of express, their stress, their pain, their agony. I would love to mention here an autobiography by Frederick Douglass. Now, this autobiography is called My Bondage and My Freedom. This was written in 1855. Now, in this autobiography, there is a particular passage, I would rather say, which runs into a few pages, where Douglass actually talks about how a slave would sing even while working. Now, here I'm also reminded of the essay by Alice Walker, In Search of My Mother's Garden, when she's talking about, the history of the African American community. She would also, talk about, as one would say, uh, a woman worker called Phyllis Chesler. Now, she would work in the field and she would improvise songs, and that would be taken up by other people who were working. So this becomes very fascinating. So as I continue with this, autobiography, in which, it is, you're talking about the condition, you're talking about the adventure, you're talking about the sensibility. So hidden meaning embedded in these songs, could be understood only by the slave community. So one of the best examples, would be that, this would be a way in which the whole community would be forged together, would be brought together. So the Great Awakening, that is the 1740s to the 1850s, would affect the religion of the Black community. Some of them would not want to leave their ancient traditional religion, but a number of them actually went on to convert to Christianity. So that would also happen. So once they became, converted, so, all those motives of even Christianity would come into their music. Let us break bread together. Some of these songs would be like this: Go down, Moses, low sweet chariot, steal away, to Jesus. So all were gospel songs which were being brought. So what then characterizes the jazz music is the deep bonding of the soul and the body. Blues, which existed in the American community, the pain and the agony would also be done. So one important aspect, of the jazz music would be the call and response. Now, what is the call and response? It gives authenticity to its defining characters. There would be a singer who would sing, and that lines would be taken up by the audience. Now, this would also remind you that, when the community was working, so there would be the leader who would, say out a line, and the others would, take up that line. It also meant it broke the traditional format of the Western music. What was that? In the Western music, the singer would sing, the audience would be the listener. So this would, prevent the audience from becoming just passive listeners. They would become active listeners, call and response. You're expected to ring back. I hope, to make you hear a particular piece, as I continue with the lecture to make you understand this, but I will do this, I'll try and get that clip for you here. So that is important to you. So it is, in a way, a protest song, a protest movement. So you have the harmony of the European music being taken. You have music like trumpet, saxophone, and others, which are loud in that way, so that you are making an attempt to shout out, and involve and rise people, to be aware of their rights, to make other people hear. And one of the important aspect of jazz music would be improvisation. You keep on improvising. The African American musics would also be about sacred rituals. Now, one of the reasons why I have been talking about the jazz music is also because Hughes himself would be in a number of times reading out his poems, singing out his poems in that way to this kind of jazz format. So that formatting, the shout out is important. Now I move on to the poem which is our concern. Now, if you look at the structure of the poem, now that is very important for us to understand. It begins with what happens to a dream deferred. Now, if you look at the structure of the poem, it is a little towards the left, and the title itself becomes the part of the poem, and the other poem, the 10 lines are indented. So you want that title to become a part of that poem. So that poem, what happens to a dream deferred, becomes the part of the rhetorical question, and it is something that you want to be there with you till the poem ends. So even the structure of the format, needs to be noted. Talking about the American dream. So what is the dream deferred? What does it really mean? I can look at it in two ways. One is, of course, the individual dream. The other is the collective dream. But then what is the American dream? The American dream is a national ethos. It's a set of ideas, let's say, which talks about democracy, which talks about equal rights, which talks about liberty, which talks about opportunities, which talks about, prosperity, success across, the society. It talks about social mobility, that anyone can be successful. Remember Arthur Miller's The Death of a Salesman? What does the great American dream mean? You've got to be smart, and if you're able to present yourself, you've got to be successful. Now, this poem is being written in 1951. It is also the time of what is known as the beat movement of poetry in American literature, which would include people like Allen Ginsberg and others, Bohemian, etc. Whether their paths crossed each other is not, what I want to, interrogate. But what I'm trying to suggest that it is the time of breaking convention. Even the beat movement poetry in American, the poetry were just not bohemian in their life attitude. They were talking about, breaking the format, the conventional attitude of the American life. So that is what they were trying to thrust, and that is what they were trying to collapse. So America was set for this. So set for, breaking conventions, it was ready for many questions. Of course, after the Second World War, in a way, America was, the most powerful nation. But, what was this most powerful nation now up to? What did it actually have? Was it, it was also giving rise to a group of disenchanted youth who did not know what to do with their life. They were disenchanted with the very format of the society. So, and Columbia University, Ginsberg had gone to Columbia University. For some time, even Hughes would be there. At the universities, where such interactions would be possible, the great American dream was part of the vocabulary of all African Americans, Americans, everyone. So that is something to be remembered. So this was the 1940s and the 50s. A generation of poets rebelled against the conventions of what is known as mainstream American life and writing. So the ideal, so the American dream is rooted in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. So these poets began to write in authentic, unfettered style. So first thought to be. So by the 50s, the Beats helped to spearhead a cultural vagabond reacting against institutionalized American values materialism, and conformity. By 1955, the Beats gave their first major public reading poetry. So here I place Langston Hughes' Harlem, in the poem in the year 1951. So the mood, as we would say, is the post-World War II. Many African Americans were disillusioned. The Great Depression was over, but for African Americans, the dream, whatever particular form it took, was being deferred. The promise of an egalitarian society was evading them. In the broad sense of the term, if I look at it, the dream refers to the Black American dream for the right, of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, of equality, of fraternity, for opportunity in the land of prosperity, of respected life. Now, if you look at the poem, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a rising in the sun? So the promise is given, but the promise never happens. The promise is made, but it never gets fulfilled. So Harlem questions the social consequences of many deferred dreams. You have laws, you legalize things, but then is that changing the life of the people? The first line, of the poem poses a large open question, and then you have what is known as the sub questions. So there's a series of questions, or fester like a sore and then run? Again, a question. Does it stink like rotten meat? Again, a question. Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Or maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So the dream in the first line and the last line, you have exploded. So the dream has exploded. So there's nothing called a dream actually, happening. The first possible answer to the questions, if I take it in this way, does it dry up like a rising in the sun? This image carries the connotation that the dream was a living entity. It was palpable, but it has shrunk. It has diminished. The next, again, or does it fester like a sore and then run? Conveys a sense of infection. It's poisonous. They moved from south to north. But, this kind of segregation, this kind of, racial hatred, apathy remained. And if you're looking again at the, Harlem Renaissance, one interesting point would be that, in South Africa, the appetite would be, common. So it would be the early part of the 20th century. Even Mahatma Gandhi would be there in South Africa, talking about, against appetite, talking about this kind of, discrimination in that way. So the next question, does it sink like rotten meat? Intensifies the disgust. A dream deferred may also sink. There's the smell of a rotten meat. It's nauseating in that way. Hughes suggests that dreams deferred will pester one to actually fall sick. You will continue to feel uncared for. You will feel that nothing is going to happen to that dream. The dream which has been crust and sugar over. It had been quoted to you. It has been a great promise, but none of this promise is actually going to remain with you. Again, the dream may sag. So this neglecting dream, this emotional baggage is something, of course, Hughes is actually putting. So the whole poem is in the structure of a rhetoric. The speaker of the poem, of course, is a poet who is talking about the dreams of equality. But these dreams never come true. Despite legal, social consensus to close the appetite, lynching continues. Black people are discriminated against. So only promissory note is being made. Nothing of that sort is brought into reality. So what is then Hughes doing? Now coming to, what kind of questions we can actually expect here. So the first thing is that, what does Hughes then examine? He examines the cause, what has deferred this particular dream. Why is this dream deferred? When dreams are continually deferred or postponed, as one would say, we are naturally hopeless. we naturally feel that, there is a heavy load. We feel that we are going to explode at any time. We can't take this, discrimination anyone. So it is as if, we have been born with a dream, but the society ensures that we stop dreaming, that we don't have the right to dream. So the poem, through this series of questions, brings to our memory the Harlem. Harlem to be answered. That is exactly the title of the poem. That, Harlem talked about equality, talked about, a cultural vibrancy, talked about a equalitarian society, but that had sort of ended with the Great Depression in the 30s. You are now almost 2 decades after that, writing. Has this world for the African Black community changed? Harlem was looked upon as a ghetto. It was said to be, a center of crime and violence. That is how it was stigmatized. So naturally, you just wanted this to be answered, that you better answer the kind of promises that you had made to us. You're talking about the great American dream, but where does it place the African Black in that particular dream is the question. The form of the poem, if I'm to talk, is very, very functional. The length is very jagged. Now you can see, as I was talking about in the jazz music of, call and response, how does it happen? What happens to a deferred dream? Question. The answer is with you. It's not that the poet is actually talking to, the answer is with you. You know that it's deferred. It's something which, then again, the question, does it dry up like a rising in the sun? Like a raisin which is put in the sun, which dries up. Is that what, your juicy, your contemplative idea about a better world is completely diminished? The answer again lies with you. So this is call and response, as one would say. Now, if you look at the last line of the poem, it is written in italics, or does it explode? Deliberate. Because, you wanted that, for how long are you going to bear? 1951, in the later part of Hughes' life, his spark would be gone, and he would no longer be considered to be a poet, of who would be able to change the world. But that is a different issue. But this particular line, what happens to a deferred dream, happened to be part of that speech that is very famous, Martin Luther Jr. I have a dream that one day little black children and little white children will walk hand in hand. That famous tree. This is, Hughes, words which are taken by, as we would say, the great civil rights activists, for the Black Martin Luther. So you can understand the influence of the poem as I was talking. First, foremost, of course, Hughes wanted this, whole Harlem to be a part of a book length, sequence. He wanted it to be longer, a montage of a dream deferred, talking about various experiences of this deferred dream. He intended to be read as a kind of a one long poem, exploring the life and the consciousness of the Black community in Harlem. So it is a kind of a continuous injustice that has been done to that community. He wanted it to, sort of present it in the poem. Harlem, is that deferred inequality of, race in that way. So this then is what? A poem about social injustice. It's a decade before, as would say, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He was also writing in the aftermath of the 1935 and 1943 Harlem riots. So it's placed in between. While the dream could be any dream that the Harlem Renaissance actually propagated, or a dream of a better life, or a dream of opportunity, or a dream of equality, or a dream, broadly speaking, of that large American dream. But the poem tells us that the dream is continually, pushed as far as the Black African community is concerned. It is something that, it is a dream that they are promised, but they're never allowed to live through. The speaker addresses the idea that deferring a dream might sometimes lessen the the glitter of the dream. You might feel that it is fading away. With each comparison, you are made to realize that deferring this dream is an injustice that is caused to this African American community. It is injustice. So it is a pain, it is a swore, it is a heavy load, it is which it sags. So, the image of explosion, in the last line, what does it explode? Then brings to our mind what? The riots of Harlem in 1935 and 1943. It also refers to the explosion of dream itself. Dream explodes. In that sense, the American dream should be busted, should be explored. It's a horse then if it is unable to include the African community in it. All experiences then should impact the injustice that has been done to them. All society should finally answer that question, so that end poem of this particular poem is full of vitality. It's full of a sense of righteousness. It is a call. It is a question. So you are to respond. Or does it explode? Will you allow it to explode? Don't you think the time has come and enough has been enough? Then it is your time to respond. So look, this tempo of that jazz music that I talked about, is very much there in this particular poem. The individual and the community is definitely referred to. Because, as I said, it can be read in two ways. One, I can talk about, a dream of the individual. I want to be successful. I want to do this. So it's an individual dream. But, I would rather stress on the social collective act of it. It's a realization of a larger collective dream. The title Harlem brings into experience of an entire community, the people who stayed at Harlem, how it became a ghetto. The dream that implicitly says, in this neighborhood of Manhattan, New York happens to be one of the richest cities. And, Harlem is like a black sword in this prosperity. How come these people have been neglected for such a long time is a question. The dream then implicitly is described that it is primarily the dream has been put at stake. It is said that it is a dream which you cannot even dream. It takes away the hope of the community. It should be, the dream could be interpreted, as a kind of a proper noun. It could be interpreted in the singular way. It should be interpreted in the plural way. But in the historical context, then Harlem, which was written in 1951, is also talking about the era of the Jim Crow segregation, the early period of the civil rights movement. It was written in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Black Americans fought in the United States military to defeat the Nazis and defend American visions of equality and liberty. But to what country they returned? They returned to a country which continued to, boo them. The black, soldiers who returned from this World War were booed. And of course, their lives of equality was shattered. So what had they fought for? What had they actually, believed in? This persistence, cynicism, the systematic racial, backlash is something that the African American continued, completely understood, by the 1950s. The white community, as I said, in the beat movement of poetry, were talking about breaking these conventions. But the question was, should these conventions of, segregating the black, lynching the black, also not be part of that, breaking? The individual dreams literally cannot be realized because collective dreams cannot be realized, because you are not protected. So how can you expect your dreams to be protected? So the title, of the poem sort of establishes the central context of the poem. The title in particular reminds us historically of the Black American location of the neighborhood of New York. In the 20th century, millions of Black Americans who had migrated to Harlem in the 1910s and 20s, which was called the Great Migration, and it became the seat of Harlem Renaissance. It was, which sought to explore and express, African American culture. This poem tends to invoke that arbiter. The title then is also to establish the geographical, political, social context in which the poem's questions are to be explored and are to be understood. If I'm talking about the language is very engaging. It sort of implicates the reader that I have put the question, I'm juxtaposing it in such a way. What happens, and then what happens, this remains to be answered. So you have the line, what happens to a dream deferred? So it's a question. So, it is by juxtapositioning, by compressing the musical qualities of dream deferred, double D, consonants rhyming together, with this particular word, naturally, continually bring us in this musical jagged way, what happens when a dream deferred? So dream deferred, you rhyme it, and what happens, is the question. So call and response. So this is, how the sounds are finally used within the poem to, evoke that response for you. Finally, deferred is not a term usually associated with dreams. Then what is it associated with? To defer literally means to postpone, to put off. That we know. Deferment is a word that has been connected with military draft, including the Second World War. Someone eligible for a draft deferment would not be drafted or deployed right away. So the word, strangely, technically, is a bureaucratic term. What am I using it here in the poem? I'm using a technical bureaucratic term against the visionary human idea of a dream. So this disjunction of the military and the dream, the level of sound, creates that tension, creates that irresolution in the poem. It's a military term, it's a bureaucratic term, but I'm using it for a dream, which is personal, which is also for a collective social identity. So you can feel that jarring effect. So if you look at the similes, if you look at the symbols, what are they? The speaker, definitely by using the symbols, of dreams, of, sore, of fester, of rotten meat, of syrupy sweet, of crust and sugar, of heavy load, the intention is very clear. You actually talk about the burden of the people. You're trying to talk about the burden of the life of the people. So again, looking at a line like, or fester like a sore and then run. This opening line establish a pattern and with some variation, and does it sting like rotten meat or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? So, you can see the how the whole thing is anaphorically, lined up. Does it like, or does it, So, if you look at this, it creates that kind of a rhyming effect. Harlem, predictably, changes this kind of, I would say, rhythmic effect. And, what is it trying to do by this, this rhythm and this kind of thing? It is trying to introduce to us the instability of life, the instability of the poem, what it is trying to say, the instability of the lives of the African. And finally, bringing us to, will it explode? Bringing together, or does it, everything, it is supposed to cause, an explosion. The explosion then is a call for final transformation, something which is startling, something which should bang, and and it finally should end this kind of hypocrisy. So the final line, the first line began with a deferred dream, with a sense of baggage, with pain, with soreness, but ends with a tempo, which ends with a vibration. So you can understand that Zad's music kind of a feeling, the kind of a sound that rises up and goes up. That is something which startles you. So. Finally, coming to the meter of the poem, so it is free flowing, it's free verse. You wouldn't be able to put it, this kind of 11 lines into a particular point of, a particular form. But this is done deliberately. The last 3 lines of the stanza, does it sink? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet. These are like singular, distinct countdown structure. I can feel the rhythm 4, 3, 2, 1. So this goes on in that way. So within the poem, you will feel a lot of juxtaposition. That means opposites are placed together. Crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet, which is, juxtaposed with the idea of a rotten meat. A rotten meat and a sweet syrup. These do not go together. So naturally, these opposites are definitely there. the moment the poem shifts into its own rhythms, this enacts the rhythms of, let's say, the candencence of the jazz music, the highs and the lows. The simple rhythms are woven into what is known as a very complex structure. Having said that, I would come to that final part of that poem where I will talk about the speaker of the heart. It's just not the poet, it is anyone within that community, within that neighborhood of Harlem who feels this sense of betrayal. Who's, of course, flabbergasted what happens to our dream, what happens to my dream. So naturally, Harlem is an observation from within. Harlem is also standing outside the Harlem history and trying to understand what it exactly is. Both together, I would say. The tone of the poem is music. It's detached. What happens? As if I'm not wanting, to make any kind of explicit comparison. So this feeling of detachment is again deliberate, trying to make a comment on the social mental fabric, which is also detached to this African American community dream or of its feel. So the setting of, is very specific. You want Harlem to be that specific. You want that black neighborhood of, New York City to be there. The images of the poem then are emotional, implicit. It exploits, it literally, brings us to that context, where you could see that, uh, see it as a kind of a protest, a kind of a displeasure, as one would say. As an individual poem, Harlem had gone on to inspire, a lot of plays, writers. One of them would be Lorien Hansberry's A Raising in the Sun. So that is definitely taken from the second line of the poem, which tells the story of a Black family's experiences in the south side of Chicago as they attempt to overcome poverty and segregation. The opening line, as I had told you before, of Harlem would also be the famous refrain of Martin Luther's speech in 1963, I Have a Dream. Today, Harlem, continues to exert its relevance as the issues the poem speaks to, including, ongoing racial things and police brutality, which resonates throughout, the African American community, even till date in America. You will probably feel, what this poem is trying to do. It is extremely unfortunate that Hughes, the later part, he was this typical case of, early rise and then, fail. So during his lifetime, there would be times, when uh, he would, of course, not be acknowledged as somebody who had contributed to the Black cause. That would be the most unfortunate thing. But this poem, the poem that we had discussed, absolutely centralizes, brings to our mind the gamut of the historical past, as well as, the context of, the civil rights movement that finally, broke, all those kind of things, separate but equal kind of a thing. It's equal at all levels. So it cannot be separate for the Black. So it breaks that kind of a thing. It is a call to break that kind of a taboo. So thank you so much for listening to me. So if there are questions, please do come up with it. And I'll try in the meantime to see that if I can make you hear that jazz piece of music that I was wanting to sort of play for you. Let's see if I can do that for you. Are there any questions?
Actually, so far we don't have any question, but now we're requesting our students to ask their queries if they have any.
I would love to answer your questions if there are any, of course. In the meantime, I'm trying to get this. Can they unmute themselves and ask? Just tell me, did you understand what I said? Let's begin with that. At least a yes or a no would help.
Yes,
Ma'am,
there is one question.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, what is the main theme of the poem?
The main theme of the poem would be to talk about, the social inequality that was rented out to the black people. Just a second for the music. So it's to talk about, the people in the Harlem Renaissance, of course, talked about black people. As I was saying, there would be boards put up, there were separate schools, even, there was not equal economic facilities for them. Harlem Renaissance did come to an end, but, this kind of segregation, lynching, looking at the black people as the other did not change. So politically, they were being given rights, but those seem to be a kind of a distant dream anyway. So this particular poem sort of questions that, says that, how long will we be prevented from achieving our dream of equality? This is our land. How long we will be, marginalized and not be allowed to be part of this mainstream thing? So that is, I would say, the theme of the poem. So if I can now just make you hear this piece of jazz music.
Thank you, ma'am.
Call and response যেটা আমি বলছিলাম তোমাদের. So see if you can hear it. Can you hear it?
Yes, ma'am.
Just wait before this particular response comes up.
Madhumita, if the sound could be a little louder, it would be easier to listen to, right? It's not clearly audible. If the sound could be a little louder.
Okay, just let me see. Now, this is exactly what I was talking about, this response. At one point, you could see this kind of groaning voices also there. There would be, some reviews which said, that is jazz actually a music, like there was groaning and this kind of, voices which were there. So naturally, there was a kind of a temperamental, kind of a pain and agony that was also being put across. And, this kind of a shout out at times, it was as if, listen, how long can we be in pain? So that, tempo, that temperament is something that I'm saying I need to use when I'm reading this poem. What happens when a dream is deferred? It's as if, I don't care, you give an answer, but does it explode? It's that, it's a kind of a shout. Or you can imagine when the poem is being read out by huges at different parties, that last line would come out very loud. If I can use it in this way, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it rise up like a raising in the sun, or fester like a sore, and then run? Does it sting like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over, like a syrup is sweet. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So, that, is, again, the musical temperament of the jazz music. So this is something I was, really wanting it to come out, because the music, the jazz music, is as much, part of that African American sensibility. It became the center of the African culture. It would be a culture of protest, in that way. It's breaking the format, In one way, it is that traditional chanting effect of the African world. You're using drums, you're using trumpets, etc. And of course, you have that European harmony coming together of it, and then this kind of a music, the kind of a groaning sound, and this kind of a loud shout out, the involvement of the audience, wanting it. So that kind of a thing, and Hughes was definitely influenced by jazz, in one part of his, I wouldn't say, a kind of a biography, but a larger interview, who said, jazz is the center of life. It expresses our culture. And I believe that, it's the essence of the African American. So he is somebody who's commenting like that. So that, sort of, answers this. Okay. Yes. So I think that also takes up, the idea of the theme that I was, also trying to present. Yes. Any more questions?
Ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, so in a way, the poet is basically instigating and motivating the people to fight for their dream and to stand to what they believe.
Absolutely. He wants that, how long will you just go by this gag, that, okay, slavery law is abolished and now you're sort of equal, but you continue to be separate. Okay, you're allowed university education. Okay, you are given, school education, but let's have separate books for you. Let's not give you employment opportunities. And, though the white, I was talking about the white laborers complaining and saying that they are, working for lesser. The black people were working for lesser. But look at the others part of this story. They had to do it. Otherwise there was no means of survival. Either way they get cut. So it is finally, sort of, who just uses this poem as to become a kind of an ambassador, as I would say, for the African American at that time. It's a crucial role, way of finally, talking about your cultural identity. You say, forget about the slavery that we have been brought as slaves, etc. We are now Americans. You talk about a great American dream. You talk about being a melting pot, but where are we in that pot? We are segregated. We are marginalized. So it's definitely a call, to break that hegemony.
And ma'am, in the last line, or does it explode? Yes. The poet is instigating. He's wanting them to do something. So in a way, he's saying, like, how do I?
Yes, he's saying that you do something to break. Don't continue to be a part of this victimized situation. Don't let violence
to just sit down, to just back sit and not do anything.
Yes, don't just let this lynching. Don't just accept. Okay, laws have been there, so I will be protected. Don't even go by that gimmick, because they are not exactly protecting you. So I, in a very little format, that's why I talked about, what happened. The laws, in a way, that separate, laws were to be taken away as late as 1964. So think, how gruesomely it had worked. 1964 it is happening, and it's almost 100 years before that. The so-called slavery laws were abolished. So you continue to fight for another 100 years to actually get your equal place in the society, and things are not good. Things are not good even today for you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes. Any more? Yes. So just let me make a brief summary of what I had said. I said I began with what is Harlem Renaissance. One reason is because the poem is Harlem, and of course it wishes to place it geographically, economically, culturally. So therefore I spoke about Harlem Renaissance. To make you understand why this Harlem actually came into existence, or why Harlem became Harlem. I talked about two things. I talked about the great migration from the south to the north, for in search of, as one would say, um, opportunities of economic possibilities. So that is something is definitely there. Then I talked about the Jim Crow laws, that though technically it was over, there was, the slavery system was over, you would have, legal laws, you would have hate groups, actually functioning and ensuring that the blacks were not incorporated or did not become part of the large white American life. So that is where I stop. Talking about Harlem Renaissance, there are a number of ways it protested, but jazz music, is one of the assembly and the central part of this particular movement, which was used as a format of protest, just not in music, but also, in poetry. It was a format which did not follow the conventional format of poetry writing, words, etc., were hitting. And within the jazz music, there are a number of things that we can talk about it. But, two things that I pointed out is the call and response, that, you involve the readers or you involve the audience into the activity of the movement. Unlike the European music, where, let's say, the audience is mute and passive. So you want the audience to become an active participant, so that the audience rises to the cause of what that music is trying to suggest, right? And the other part of this jazz music is, as I said, the format, the loudness of it, shouting out, sometimes groaning, etc. Something that you will not find in the usual format of it. And jazz suited that conventional format of African chanting, of religion, etc. Religion being very central, to the African way of life, moving away from the traditional format of the religion to becoming Christianized, but religion remained an important aspect of their life. So the chanting, the time that, that remained part of their lives is also reflected in jazz. Now, talking about Hughes, he is a kind of an identity whose father, of course, didn't want himself to be called a black. He was rich enough by himself. Hughes, talked about building a black identity, writing in 1951. So just after the 1935 and 1943 Harlem violence, as one would say, where lynching and violence would continue against the black people, and a decade away from the 1964, civil rights laws that would come. And it would be, at that particular point, there would be the beat poetry movement, which would include, white American poets like Allen Ginsberg and others, who were also talking about breaking the conventional thought process and, thinking process of the American life. So what I'm also trying to say, the time is congenial, and this is the right time to talk and the right time to explore. So, in a way, Hughes is trying or calling out through his poem to form a new black identity. The African American community is being asked to do it. I looked at the structure of the poem, saying the title is a question that you want to be answered through the poem. It raises the tempo slowly, busting out in the end, as if finally you are calling out to the hearers, the listeners, that it is time that you explode and fulfill that promise that Harlem had one day seen. So it is recalling that past, recalling that, the energy that Harlem had shown, which had collapsed because of the Great Depression. And, it needed now to be taken up again. And we can understand it was taken up. There would be civil rights movement, and of course, you would have Martin Luther and others coming up. So that was more or less, what I had talked about today. Anything else?
I think they have understood the critical aspect of this poem, Harlem. So, once again, thank you very much,
So.
Dr. Majumder. And I hope our students and the fellow students from various different colleges would definitely be benefited from this lecture. So, thank you once again, and thank you to their students as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm leaving the meeting then.
Yes. Here you stop.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.